Hello. Welcome to week 4 of the Intro to Documentary Filmmaking course. Today's session is all about post-production. I promise I'm gonna keep this one as short and sweet as possible because we're getting to the stage where we're actually getting ready to do the work. If you haven't up to this point, the next couple of weeks will be in the lab. And so this is the last stage of preparation for getting all of your footage and stuff together before we actually get into the nitty-gritty. So week 4 is all about post-production, and post-production is the stage that occurs after production day. So by this time or at some point, you would have filmed your subject, your concept, and you have your footage, whether it be through your phone or you decided to use your actual camera. And now it's time to store all of this footage in complementary assets, i.e. B-roll, photos, archival footage, documents to scan to add to your story into its rightful place. So for me, after production day, where I store all of my content, I use an external hard drive. I also use Dropbox, and I also use Google Drive. I make backups of everything. I actually have 2 external hard drives for my footage, and then I designate them in their own separate folders so it can be easier to find when it is time to actually begin editing. So for example, A-roll is considered their actual interview of your subject. And so A-roll would be labeled if the name of your subject in its own respectful folder. Come back on. B-roll will have its own separate folder. Photos that you would use within your B-roll will have its own separate folder. The more organized you are, again, when it comes to pre-production, again, the more organized you are, the better and more seamless this process will be. Now, remember, we are keeping this as simple as possible. So when it comes to actual editing, what I recommend, if you have a Mac, I recommend iMovie. If you do not, or even if you do have a Mac or Apple product, CapCut for desktop. iMovie is free. CapCut has a monthly subscription price that is a low cost, but I use CapCut for everything. All of my short form content that I use for myself, all of the content that I shoot for my clients, I use CapCut. Now, for my film, I use Adobe Premiere. I have the entire Adobe Creative Suite. If you are familiar with that, I recommend using that too, but for the sake of this project, highly recommend either iMovie or CapCut. They're both pretty user intuitive. It's not a huge learning curve. Highly recommend one of those two. And it's easier. Sorry, something was going on outside. Easier to use. So for the phase of post-production, what I would like for you to do is get your story on a timeline, which means all of your interviews to put on a timeline together. Don't think about the aesthetics. Don't think about how it looks. What I tell clients to do when they get their story together is to put it all on a timeline. And what I mean the timeline is what your editing software is. So when you drag and drop your footage into the actual editing software and you piece it together how you want the story to go. So how you may have interviewed your subject may not necessarily be how it'll play out in the end. So maybe they said something amazing towards the end of your interview that actually makes more sense to put at the beginning of your timeline. I don't want to get too detailed into that because remember, we're keeping it at the basics. So getting your story together, and once you have that on your timeline together, play it back with your eyes closed. Does the story make sense with your eyes closed? What type of imagery pops up for you as you're listening to it? And then we can get into the weeds of the B-roll. I know some of you are like, Alana, I keep hearing you talking about B-roll. What exactly do you mean? So B-roll is essentially complementary content that adds texture to your story. So it can be direct B-roll, meaning if you are interviewing a basketball coach, and that B-roll, which essentially would be A-roll, would be them at their game. You are watching them in their element at the game, right? Or if their sit down interview is talking about how they are as a coach, or maybe you're talking to one of their players and the players is giving insight on how it is getting coached by that person, you would incorporate footage of that game to go over the actual A-roll interview. And what B-roll does, it adds more texture to the film, so you're not sitting there looking at a talking head the entire time. And so as you're listening, and it was helpful when you're listening to your subject, as you're filming, as you're interviewing your subject, have things in mind when they say certain things. So if you're doing a historical project and somebody's talking about when they were younger, what they like to do when they were younger, you may have them send you some photos from their childhood. You may have them send you pictures from when they were in school to add to their story. Something to note when it comes to editing or just post-production in general, this is not something that can be completed in one sitting. It is also not something that can be rushed through, and I guarantee you that the story that you come up with on day one and how it looks at whatever the last day of for your edit is not going to be the same. The thing about documentary filmmaking, although it is nonfiction and truth telling, the story that you get is the one that's just what it is. I consider it the skeleton, the spine, right? And so it's like a bone broth, right? You're putting it in there and you just kind of put different ingredients in there throughout the story for it to make a beautiful stew. So you can't necessarily control it. You kind of let it serve as a guide for the story that you're trying to tell, because again, even though it's nonfiction and it's truth telling, it can also incorporate bias. Conversation for another day. But let the story kind of guide itself, and you are there as guardrails to keep it from veering off into territory that doesn't enhance the story. And so it takes a couple of different iterations. It takes another pair of eyes who may not be familiar with the story to make sure it even makes sense to them. It may take another pair of eyes from somebody who's familiar with the story to make sure that it is accurate. When I was in the early stages of post-production for my film, The Kinlock Doc, which at this point I hope you have watched, I actually did a community screening with a few people. I had half the people in the room were former residents of that city, and then the other half of people in that room were people who were in the industry. So I had the people from the city in there to make sure that all of the information that I was inputting into the film was accurate. Again, I wasn't from the community. I basing off other people's interviews and research that I did to make sure that everything I was putting in there was accurate. And then I had people from the industry in there to make sure that the technicals, I was hitting on the technical side, from my audio to how I was syncing things together to the technical pieces of filmmaking, right? And so it's always helpful to have another pair of eyes to make sure that you are staying on course, because the thing about you being the creator, it is very easy to get lost into the weeds. You get inundated with just watching your footage over, and then you just kind of get tired of it after a while. So it's not something that can be done in a day. It does take time. The biggest piece of advice I can share and what was given to me was don't marry the content, meaning the vision that you may have had in your head in the very beginning. Don't marry that idea, because as your story comes together, as you're watching it, as you're hitting like your 2 to 3 minute target for the very end of the film, there may be something in there that you really, really wanted to put in there, but after reviewing it again and say, this doesn't really enhance the story and I'm okay with releasing this. Or maybe it is you've interviewed more than one person, you've interviewed a few people to tell this story, and after you're watching, you say, this interview isn't as strong as I thought it would be. Now that I'm seeing everybody together, I'm okay with releasing this person from the project because it doesn't enhance the story. So you are allowing the story to kind of take shape on its own while you were putting the pieces together. A tip, which is an extra step, but this helps me a lot. Before getting to the nitty-gritty of the edit on the timeline, what I did is take my interviews, take the audio from all of my interviews and got them transcribed. And really all I did was upload my interviews to a software database called Temi, T-E-M-I. And I had it export all of my interviews in a written format. And so what I did, I put my script together, because again, it's documentary filmmaking, it's nonfiction, but there's still a script. There's still a story that you have to abide by to make sure everything is cohesive. I wrote my script. I started my story in written format. So before I actually started putting clips together on the timeline, I started building out my story through text first, and I would read through each script from my interviews, and they're also time coded, so that's super helpful. So the time code that's going to be on the timeline as you're editing or from the actual footage is going to match the time code that's written. So I would copy, interview A. If they said something at, the 8-minute mark, I would copy and paste what they said and then put it on a separate Microsoft Word doc. That became my actual written script. So once that script was completed, once I felt secure in the written script, I then went back to find the actual footage and put it on the timeline of Premiere, or in your case, CapCut or iMovie. So if you're somebody who just needs an extra step to see how you can piece it together, and if you don't want to get inundated with watching footage over and over again, taking this step and getting your interviews transcribed and seeing it in written format, it's very cost efficient. It was very, again, my interviews are an hour and a half, 2 hours long, and they were maybe like $12 to transcribe. Adobe Premiere, if you use it, also has the option to provide captions for your footage too. But I highly recommend to me. It's another step, but I think it's super, super efficient in this process. Y'all. So next week will be all about marketing, how to market your film and just kind of getting eyes on it. But for the sake of this, the intro to documentary filmmaking, to telling your story, to the interviews, to pre-production, production, and post-production, next week starts after the film about marketing. We're getting into the lab. So it's 3 weeks of lab work, which means you can have that time to work on your film. You have time and access with me. If you have questions about piecing your stuff together, definitely reach out to me. If you want to come into our open office hours, if you have questions like, hey, this is what I'm working on, you can share your screen with me and we can walk through it together. Please, please, please use me as a resource. I know we are all busy. We have kids, we have extracurricular activities. We're trying to make some money in this crazy world. We got school and all the things, but please use me as a resource. My schedule is super busy, as you can tell by my delayed videos that I've been updating or uploading, but I am committed to this course. I am committed to being a resource for you all who may be interested in this creative side that you are just now embarking on. So again, use me as a resource. Take this time to get your story together. Pace yourself. You do not have to rush. You do not have to follow the guidelines of this course of just being an 8-week course. But I am here. I will see you all next week. Take care.